So I have a story today on the ongoing humanitarian crisis that's happening in Yemen. For those of you who might not be familiar with the story, prior to 2014, the Saudi government had control over the president of Yemen. I think his name was Abdul Salah. He was basically an authoritarian dictator who was corrupt and taking a whole bunch of money from Saudi officials and did whatever the Saudi government told him to do in Yemen. Again, like I mentioned, it led to a lot of corruption and mistreatment of the people. Yemen is one of the poorest countries in the region. It actually is the poorest country in the region. So they had economic problems, political problems, and in 2014 it all came to a head. And the president at the time, since he was aligned with the Saudi Arabian government, he was Sunni, and the regime in power was Sunni, and the people in Yemen were, I think, the majority Shia. So those are two different ideologies within the Muslim religion. And the Sunnis, which are backed by Saudi Arabia, had control of the country. Then 2014 happened. It came to a boiling point, and they overthrew the Sunni government. The Shia rebels overthrew the Sunni government. And since the Shia more aligned with Iran, which is like Saudi Arabia's mortal enemy, the Saudi government wasn't having it, so they threw a temper tantrum and basically started a war to take the country back from the Shia rebels. That was already illegal, seeing how the Saudi government has no business in the affairs of Yemen. They should have stayed out of it from the beginning. They had no business in the telling the people who should be running the country and giving demands like that. So they threw a temper tantrum, started the war, and ever since then it's been a genocide. That's what it is. Because some people would like to describe it as a civil war, but a civil war is something that's happening between factions in a single country, and they're taking losses on both sides. That's how a civil war usually goes. But what this is the Saudi government, backed by the U.S. and our allies, the most powerful militaries on the planet, are doing an assault on the people of Yemen who cannot defend themselves. They don't have nearly the same amount of firepower we do, or money to fund their army as we do. They don't even have an air force. So this is really a genocide, and the numbers prove it, and I'll get to that in a later story. But the U.S., since we have this unholy alliance with the Saudi Arabian government, largely having to do with oil and things like that, and regional power, since Saudi Arabia is one of the most powerful, it might be the most powerful country in the Middle East. So we have this alliance with them, we basically let them do whatever they want, unquestioned and unchallenged. So when they got involved in Yemen and started the war, of course the U.S. got involved and backed them. So since then we've been giving them billions of dollars in weapons, missiles and mortar rockets and fighter jets and all those things. On top of us selling billions and billions of dollars of weapons to the Saudi government to do this genocide, we are refueling their planes that they're using to do the airstrikes on civilians, and we are also giving them the coordinates to bomb the civilians on the ground in Yemen. And we're supporting them in many other ways. So the U.S. is very involved in this, and you could call this a U.S. war because, like I mentioned, we're giving them military support, we're giving them weapons, we're refueling their jets, we're giving them coordinates. So we're as involved as humanly possible without having troops on the ground in Yemen. And like I mentioned, there are war crimes being committed brazenly. The Saudi government and the Saudi military has, as well as the United Arab Emirates, they're very involved in this too, have been bombing hospitals and schools and mosques and civilian neighborhoods, bombing apartments, and it's clear that they are not targeting rebels or any militants. They are going after all of the citizens in Saudi in Yemen. And the reason why they're doing this is because they are trying to, it's basically terrorism, and they're trying to beat the country into submission. So destroying the infrastructure, destroying, making the country impossible to live off of, and crippling the country so that they don't put up a fight again when the Saudis come in to reinstate their puppet dictator to control the government. So that is their goal here. And while all this is happening, the international community and the bodies that are set up to prevent things like this from happening are sitting back and just watching this happen. So the UN, whose main goal is to facilitate peace and prevent war, the UN is basically in the pocket of the Saudi government and the US government and our allies. And the reason for this is because Saudi Arabia and the US are the most powerful countries, among the most powerful countries on the planet. We give a large amount of the funding that goes to the UN comes from both of these countries. So even though the UN is supposed to be unbiased and it's supposed to be neutral and it's supposed to be looking out for the welfare of civilians, they feel like they can't do that without pissing off the US and Saudi Arabia. And if that happens, the US will threaten to pull the necessary funding that goes to UN programs, peacekeeping programs, and things like that, and Saudi Arabia the same. So the UN is basically not doing anything about it for fear of losing funding and other things like that. The International Criminal Court, who's supposed to be investigating and prosecuting war crimes and war criminals, again, they have these same corrupt ties to the U.S. government and the Saudi government, who are the main perpetrators of the war crimes. So even though the International Criminal Court is specifically meant to prosecute war criminals, they are being run by the war criminals, and they have no intention of doing that. And then, which brings me to Hadida. So earlier this year, about a month ago, 2 months ago, there were fears that the Saudi government was going to go after the last remaining rebel-held port in Yemen, and that port is Hadida. That is one of the most important port cities because, like I mentioned before, the Saudi government, the Saudi military has destroyed Yemen's infrastructure. So they've destroyed the markets and the hospitals and things like that. So one of the only places in the entire country, and they have a blockade of the country, so they're not allowing almost any food or medical supplies or anything to get into the country to help the people there, which is called siege warfare. And again, that's another war crime that's illegal under international laws for very clear reasons. It almost exclusively targets the civilians, and the civilians are supposed to be off limits during times of war. So there's a blockade of the country, and one of the only places that supplies are able to get in is the port of Hadida. And there were fears that the Saudi government was going to try to take the port city to completely block the country off and restrict access from the outside world and keep all supplies from getting in. Everybody saw how much of a disaster this was going to be. There were people making a huge deal out of it and telling the Saudi government, do not do this because it's going to be a disaster. The UN put out a report saying, if the Saudis and the United Arab Emirates try to take the port city of Hadida, which the population is about 500 to 600,000 people that live there, there is a possibility that as much as 250,000 people, 250,000 people in the city could be killed from the fighting. So that number is mind blowing. When I first heard it, I almost couldn't believe it, and the fact that the Saudis saw that number and they said, "Fuck it, I'm gonna do it anyway," is unspeakable. And so they decided to go after the port city of Hodeidah, and they started the assault. And as expected, there's been a massive number of civilians killed in the fighting, and thousands of people are trying to flee the city, but they don't have time to, and they're basically stuck and locked in place because at all times there are airstrikes and drone strikes going on, and if you go outside you might get killed. So which brings me to this article from the Middle East Eye. The title of the article is 60 Dead After Airstrikes Hit Hospital and Market in Hodeidah. Yes, so 60 people were killed from this one these airstrikes in the city on that day. That is insane. That number is insane. Airstrikes thought to be conducted by the Saudi-led coalition have hit a hospital's entrance, fishing port, and fish market in the Yemeni city of Hodeidah, killing scores of people. A source at Hodeidah's health office told Middle East Eye that 60 people were killed in the strikes on Thursday, with more than 100 wounded. According to witnesses, the strikes at the hospital hit as casualties were taken from the port and the market. Quote, while I was coming back to my house to chew cod with my family, I heard warplanes hover over Hodeidah, end quote. Al Tabit, a 38-year-old resident of Hodeidah city, told Middle East Eye, quote, Then I heard an airstrike target the fish market, and the buzzing of warplanes was clearer after the attack, end quote. After that, people went to take the casualties to several hospitals, including Al Thawra Hospital, but the warplanes returned to hover again. Tabit said no one expected the warplanes to target the entrance of the hospital, which is usually crowded with civilians, but it did. He added that it seemed as if the warplanes were chasing the casualties, and the second batch of strikes killed more than the first. Quote, after the second airstrike, people were praying Allah would take revenge on the Saudis. Quote, when I went nearer to see the impact, I saw a motorcyclist who had been killed, but his hands did not leave the motorcycle. I cannot forget this scene, which left a bad impression about the Saudis. The source in Hodeidah's health office said medical workers were struggling to respond to patients' needs. Quote, the hospitals suffer from lack of medicine, equipment, and doctors because of the war. And yesterday, the doctors could not help all casualties, he told Middle East Eye. Quote, I appeal to international organizations to support the health system in Hodeidah to help people when the Saudis target them, as this is not the first time the airstrikes target people. The International Committee of the Red Cross said on Twitter it was sending medical equipment to Al Thawra Hospital to treat those in critical condition following the attack. Staff working for Save the Children, which runs a diphtheria treatment center in the hospital, described the situation after the strikes as chaos. A bomb exploded just outside the hospital on the street, one staff member said. Quote, Then there was another explosion toward the back. I saw people running and bodies were in the street. Despite Houthis' Despite the Houthis' lack of an air force, the Saudi-led coalition laid the blame at the rebels' door and insisted it was not behind the strike. Quote, the coalition did not carry out any operations in Hodeidah that day, the coalition spokesman, Colonel Turki al-Malki, told Al Arabia television. Quote, the Houthi militia are behind killing of civilians in Hodeidah on Thursday. Quote, the coalition follows a strict and transparent approach based on the international law. We pursue any allegation, and if there is any responsibility, we will hold it transparently, he said. Pro-Yemeni government activists and media accuse the Houthis of targeting the civilians with ballistic missiles, suggesting that the rebels did so to make the coalition look bad. Ali al-Makash, a pro-government fighter in the Marib province, told Middle East Eye, quote, the Houthis usually exploit the hovering of Saudi-led warplanes to target civilians on purpose in order to trick the world into thinking that the coalition targets civilians. This is just bullshit. Meanwhile, the United Nations said it will invite the parties involved in the Yemen's conflict for talks on September 6th. UN Special Envoy to Yemen Martin Griffith told the UN Security Council that, quote, a political solution to end the war in Yemen is available, and urged world powers to support the new push for peace negotiations. Quote, these consultations will provide the opportunity for the parties, among other things, to discuss the framework for negotiations, relevant confidence building measures, and specific plans for moving the process forward. Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and regional allies have been fighting in Yemen with Western backing for more than 3 years against the Iran-aligned Houthis. The Houthis control much of North Yemen, including the capital city of Sana'a, and drove its Saudi-backed government into exile in 2014. On Tuesday, the Houthis said they were unilaterally halting attacks in the Red Sea for 2 weeks to support peace efforts. This came a few days after Saudi Arabia suspended oil exports through a strategic Red Sea channel amid Houthis' attacks on crude tankers on July 25th. About 70% of Yemen's food imports flow through Hodeidah's port. About 8.4 million Yemenis are said by aid workers to be on the verge of starvation. On June 13th, Saudi Arabia and its allies in a pro-government coalition launched a major offensive to retake Hodeidah. Fighting around the port has raised UN fears of a new humanitarian catastrophe in the country, already at the brink of famine and facing a deadly cholera epidemic. The Houthis have offered to hand over management of the port to the world body, according to the United Nations, but the coalition says the group must quit the western coast. On Friday, the UN's World Health Organization said Yemen may be on the brink of a new cholera epidemic with greater chance of a high death rate due to widespread malnutrition. Quote, we're calling on all parties to the conflict for 3 full days of tranquility to lay down arms to allow us to vaccinate the civilian population for cholera. World Health Organization Emergency Response Chief Peter Salama said. Now, before I break down the article and get into my analysis of it, I want to read a dictionary definition of the word genocide. So it says, quote, the deliberate killing of a large group of people, especially of a particular ethnic group or nation. Now, the reason why I read that dictionary definition of the word genocide is because in mainstream media and mainstream politics, establishment and establishment figures in politics, they hesitate to use the word genocide whenever they're describing U.S. military action or the military action of our allies. But clearly, if you go by the dictionary definition of the word, any objective interpretation of the article I just read and an overall reading of the situation in Yemen, it is clearly a genocide. Now, you can disagree with that. You can object to using that word, but understand that you are just factually and objectively incorrect. Because I already just said I read you the dictionary definition of the word genocide: the deliberate killing of a large group of people, especially of a particular ethnic group or nation. And let me stress again that this is not a civil war, because a civil war is between two warring factions of a country that are fighting over control in the future and the direction of that country. Now, what this is the most powerful countries, arguably on the planet, with the U.S. military, the United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, and all of our allies, making the concerted effort to interfere and intervene in the going-ons of a country that has nothing to do with us. We are imposing our idea of how the country should be run onto them. We are forcing it onto them by use of military action. And again, these are the most powerful militaries on the planet. It is not a fight. This is not so. Get out of the realm of civil war. We already established that this is not a civil war by just simply the actors that are involved. Now let's get into the article. This first quote: after that, people went to take the casualties to several hospitals, including Al-Thara Hospital, but the warplanes returned to hover again. It seemed as if the warplanes were chasing the casualties. The second batch of strikes killed more than the first. Okay, now let's be clear. Targeting civilian markets, targeting markets where you know civilians are going to be, and in this case it was a fish market, is a war crime. This is what the international community, this is what almost every country on the planet has signed on to for specific reason. Namely, after World War II, when we saw the destruction of major cities in Europe and like in the UK and in Germany and in France, the world decided that targeting civilians is not acceptable. Especially with the way our technology and weaponry was evolving, if we did not make it very clear that you cannot target civilians, it would lead to, again, the next time there was a major conflict in the world, millions and millions of civilians being killed and slaughtered, like what happened in World War I and World War II. So the world came together after that and made the decision in several treaties and agreements, like the Geneva Conventions and the Nuremberg Tribunals, that we will not target civilians. And anybody who is caught doing that, that is among the highest crimes. That is a crime against humanity, and you will be prosecuted and tried, and you will likely be put to death or spend the rest of your life in prison. That was what we all agreed upon, but the U.S. seems to be, and our allies seem to think we're above the law because we just do this shit brazenly and we almost dare anybody to check us on it. Now, again, in this case, we target the markets. Now, there is almost no case to be made that they were going after rebels or that they were going after militia on the ground. They were following the injured to then bomb the hospitals. Now in the early 2000s, in the height of these wars, Chelsea Manning leaked footage from U.S. warplanes and attack helicopters of our troops deliberately killing civilians on the ground in Iraq and Afghanistan. And you could see, because it's, again, this video, you could see the women and the children and the people who were just standing in the street. They were being gunned down and bombed by our attack helicopters and our warplanes. And it's on video. And then as the video continues, the ambulances and the first responders who were coming to try to provide aid to the people who were injured, they were then target of a next round of attacks and airstrikes, which is called a double tap. And you do this to deliberately kill or go after the first responders, the doctors and the nurses and the EMTs who are going to aid the injured. This is so, again, illegal under international law, because these are not only civilians on the ground. You are going after doctors and medical workers who are definitely off limits, because their entire objective in just regular operations and in times of war is to aid the injured and to save lives. But here you see that the Saudi coalition is definitely targeting these people on purpose. Or else why would you, after you did the airstrike on the marketplace, and here's the thing, they could have stopped at any point. They did the airstrike on the marketplace. They could have seen that they killed and injured dozens of civilians, and they could have stopped right there, right? But instead, they followed those people, they followed those ambulances to the hospitals that they were going to help these people, and bombed the hospitals. So even more people died. That is insanity. Now, they got this again from the U.S. They picked up this tactic from the U.S. So it's interesting to see how this has progressed, because clearly nobody has the U.S. government didn't have a problem with it after it was revealed from Chelsea Manning and her leaks that we were doing it, because again, they've continued doing this with drone strikes and airstrikes in Iraq, Afghanistan, and Syria, elsewhere in the Middle East. But now our allies, Saudi Arabia, are emboldened because they watch us doing this and they see that there's no consequences for it. So they take it upon themselves to use this tactic when they're at war or committing a genocide here in Yemen. Now, in the article they mentioned that there is almost no medical supplies and no medical staff to treat the injured people from these airstrikes, and that is because of the blockade that I mentioned before. So on top of killing civilians and deliberately bombing them in civilian areas like this marketplace, they are making it even harder for the people on the ground, because they are not allowing medical supplies and doctors in. And again, that is siege warfare. That is illegal under international law. So you can keep counting up the war crimes, because it gets pretty high. It gets pretty high. And this is just one story. So, and here's where it gets fucking crazy. If now the coalition denies involvement in these airstrikes. Quote, coalition didn't do operations that day. That sounds fishy to me. I'm not a expert in military operations, but I don't know why you would have warplanes flying over one of the hottest, most contested war zones in the entire country if you were not conducting military operations. That seems to be contradicting at face value, it contradicts their claim that they weren't doing military operations. And like the article mentioned, they are literally the only side in this conflict that has warplanes and has an air force. So if somebody's doing bombs and dropping bombs from airplanes, it is almost guaranteed it is coming from the Saudi coalition, because they are the only ones in this conflict with an air force. Now, they say that when rebels hear Saudi warplanes, they use their missiles to bomb civilians so they can blame the Saudis. Okay, again, now this is such a shitty and not even carefully planned excuse and cover up of the brazen attack on civilians, and it's almost comical. If it wasn't a cover up of such a heinous attack that killed 60 people, it would be this excuse that they're putting out, the statement that they're putting out, would be fucking laughable. Because again, they say that they hear the warplanes. So even them, the Saudi coalition, the putting out the statement, they're saying that they did have warplanes and that the rebels did hear the warplanes. So again, why are there warplanes flying over a war zone if they aren't conducting military operations, contradicting the first part of their statement? But they bomb the civilians after they hear the warplanes so that they can blame the Saudis. Okay. That would be the dumbest of the dumb strategies, because, like I mentioned, this has been going on. This genocide has been going on since 2014, and every single week there's multiple reports of the Saudi U.S. coalition bombing a hospital, bombing a school, bombing an apartment building, bombing a market. So multiple accounts, verified accounts of them targeting civilians, and up until this point there has been little to no, actually there has been no accountability for any of these war crimes and attacks on civilians. So why would the rebels on the ground think it is a smart strategy to bomb civilians and then blame the Saudis? Because to do that, you would have to think that there would be consequences if the world found out that the Saudis were bombing civilians. But clearly that's not the case, because out of all the times that they did bomb civilians and it's been verified that it was them who killed the civilians, there's been no consequences for it. So if you are the rebels on the ground, why would you bomb your own people? Again, it's not just random ass people on the streets. These are their own people. These are their family members. These are their friends. Why would you do that in search of a consequence that would never come? Because again, the U.S. are the biggest violators of international law and are the biggest perpetrators of war crimes. And up until this point, not a single U.S. president has been tried for war crimes or any that we need to be sanctioning Saudi Arabia because they're the biggest human rights, one of the biggest human rights violators on the planet, along with the U.S. And if it's the latter, then just stop pretending like you do care about human rights, because you clearly don't. And there needs to be criminal investigations into these wars. There needs to be, the International Criminal Court needs to do war crimes investigations. The U.S. government needs to do war crimes investigations. And anybody who's found to be involved, that includes the U.S. military, that includes the Pentagon, that includes the Secretary of Defense and Secretary of State, that includes the President, and anybody in the executive branch who's approving this and all these military actions, they need to be under investigation. Same with the Saudi government and the Saudi military. Same with the Emiratis and the Emirati government. So all of us need to be under investigation for this, and there should be prosecutions and there should be justice for this, because there's thousands and thousands of people dying from this war, and there seems to be no accountability. There's nobody held responsible for this. So that's what needs to happen. Is it going to happen? Hell no. Fuck no, that's not going to happen. And it's going to continue until I don't know when. And that's my final point. I don't know when this ends. I don't know when they've had enough. I don't know when the Saudis are going to say, okay, we're done here. We're going to stop. This is madness. Because it seems like I mentioned earlier in the video, they're going to try to beat Yemen into submission. They're going to destroy the infrastructure. They already destroyed half the hospital. Half the hospitals in the country don't even work. They're not even operational because of these airstrikes and because of the blockade. So it seems like they're going to beat this country into submission to the point where they would be scared shitless after Saudi Arabia installs their next puppet dictator to run the government in Yemen. The people and the civilians and the rebels will be scared shitless to ever try to overthrow the government again, because they are afraid that something like this would happen. That seems like that's what the ultimate goal here is, and it's disgusting. And like I mentioned, nobody's talking about it. The mainstream media isn't talking about it. Congress has barely done anything about it. Actually, they haven't done anything about it. They just approved the $700 billion Pentagon budget. They haven't said shit about the $100 billion weapons deal that Donald Trump signed with the Saudi government. So they aren't doing anything about it, and it's just gross. And this should be topic of discussion in every household in America because it's being done with our money. And it's not, but the only people who are covering it, independent media, Democracy Now!, Secular Talk with Kyle Kalinske, the Young Turks cover it once in a while, Jimmy Dore's show, he covers it, The Humanist Report, they do some reporting on it. And like I mentioned, Amy Goodman at Democracy Now!, there are very few independent media outlets there are very few independent media outlets, serious ones, and they are doing the best they can to cover this, but more people need to be covering it. And that's why I'm covering it on my show. That's why I'm going to make this a topic of discussion on my show, because it's important and everybody in the country should know what's going on. Because right now, we're committing the worst human rights violation, responsible for the worst humanitarian crisis on the planet. And it's all avoidable. It can all stop immediately if anybody really cared enough to make it stop. So that's the point of this segment. And the point of me covering stories like Yemen, to make people aware, to make people want to make this stop, because this is just madness. At this point, this is insanity.